about the word, talk to you about the words made in China and made in the USA and what that means from the perspective of someone who's manufacturing. Not from the perspective of someone who's using these products that are made in China or made in the USA, but from the person who is going to China or going to the United States and making these things. A year ago, I had the opportunity to go to Shenzhen, China, where I spent 3 months developing my own consumer electronics product. After that, I came back to the United States and was working in Wisconsin, developing and continuing to manufacture that product. And I learned a lot about what China has to offer and what the United States has to offer. And to boil it down, they're just different. You can't really compare the two because they are so different in how they work. I'm going to try, and I'll tell you a little bit about that experience. So China is different. Socially, culturally, economically, politically. They're currently undergoing turmoil as they transition from a capitalist or communist economy to a capitalist economy. And as they do that, they're going through a lot of change in one generation. There are companies that spring into existence in a week. One day, I was dining at a restaurant. A week later, it had closed, sold, completely changed, and a week later, I was dining in a dessert store. It was just one place was like this. And factories are blinking in and out of existence so fast that nobody can keep track of it. And vast, vast areas of farmland are being changed into industrial or urban areas. And we can't really deny them that change or criticize them because they're doing the exact same thing that most developed nations have done in their past. Wisconsin used to be the same way. We had low wages, we had poor working conditions, and we were manufacturing a lot of the things that ended up in Chicago and Detroit in larger things that then went on to your homes and cars. So but I don't want to say that China is behind the United States either, because in a lot of ways, they're much more advanced or have capabilities that the United States never really had the opportunity to develop. So I'll talk about a few of the major points of difference. And the first one to talk about is infrastructure, because infrastructure is how everything is built. China is enormous, and it's growing really fast. There are over 150 cities with more than 1 million people, and many with more than 10 million. The city that I lived in for 3 months is Shenzhen, and it has 10 million people now. 30 years ago, it had 250,000 people. It is growing so fast that this ship, which was brought in so that expats would have a place to live while they were doing their development, couldn't get out fast enough and is now a half-mile inland because all of Shenzhen grew around it. It's incredible how fast things can happen. This is Min's booth. She sells enclosures for electronics or consumer goods. And she sells plastic and metal, and basically she represents a company somewhere else in China, but she focuses on these particular parts. That is her job, 10 hours a day, mostly 6 days a week, in this booth. She is one booth on this floor, and each one of these booths sell different components. So there will be power supplies and resistors and microcontrollers, everything that you need to build your product. That floor is one floor of 6 in this building. And each one of these floors sells successively more complex parts. So at the top floor, there are completely built computers. And this building is one in an entire district of 12 blocks, all of them containing buildings with floors of booths. And all of these things make it really easy for someone to go source all of your components and talk to everyone you need to find someone to manufacture everything you need to do. And it's so fast and easy. But if you look at how the United States works, yes, everything is more distributed, but we also have the internet, where I can go online and look at the companies and compare all of their products and do it in one sheet and compare prices on not just one component, but quantities of 1,000 or 10,000. And I can get data sheets that tell me exactly how these components work, so that I don't need to risk just talking to someone and asking them, does this thing do what you're telling me it should? But I can look at the data sheet and it will tell me exactly what I need to know. This is an injection mold tool. And injection molding is when you take two large pieces of metal and clamp them together and shove plastic into it at a high temperature and then cool it down, and out comes a piece of plastic. Now there's a difference when you're going to a manufacturer between a China mold and a US mold. And they specifically say China mold and US mold because there is a huge difference in how they're made. A China mold is cheaper steel. It comes in usually at a quarter of the price, and it doesn't have some of the features that a US mold would have, like cooling lines, which means you can have shorter cycle times. And the biggest difference is that China molds require someone to stand next to that machine the entire time that it's running. So a US mold will be highly automated and will have really short cycle times, really high quality steel that means you can get more parts out of it. And the China mold is cheaper and it is a little faster and looser. But when you look at the cost difference, maybe you don't plan to run that many parts. So maybe it does make more sense to go with the China mold. And talking about having someone at this machine all the time brings up the next point, which is automation is becoming more and more used, both in China and the United States. So this is a factory in the United States. It's actually just an hour away from here, and one of many that I toured when I came back. And the thing to note about this factory is that it is so highly automated that the job of 100 people in China is reduced to less than a dozen. So when you have so much automation taking place, the real difference in price, the labor cost disappears. And it becomes just the machine cost. And so that difference between China and the United States starts to disappear as all you're considering is the machine time. And the United States has been investing in that infrastructure because labor costs in the United States have been so high for so long that it makes more sense to invest in these tools. And China, because labor rates have been low, has not done that. And so as things move forward, China is now moving up in their investment in these tools, and the labor rates in China are increasing too. And so that difference in cost kind of disappears. And that's the biggest part about deciding to manufacture in the United States or China, is cost. Because at the end of the day, I'm trying to run a business, and if my business loses money, then it's not a business anymore. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the capabilities that China has that the United States doesn't. And one of those is with, this sort of has to do with infrastructure as well, but the circuit board manufacturing. Basically what happened was the United States outsourced all printed circuit board manufacture to China for decades and didn't really develop that technology in the United States. And so now we're at a point where, yeah, there are some circuit board manufacturers in the United States, but they're expensive and few and far between. Whereas in China, they have this infrastructure. They've done it for so long, they're really good at it. And it's a quarter of the cost. So in some situations, it makes more sense to go with a China manufacturer of a certain part, just because they're so good at it because they've been doing it for so long. But there are a lot of hidden costs that are associated with manufacturing in China. A lot of costs that you take your spreadsheet and you say, okay, this part costs this much to make in the United States and it costs this much to make in China. And you've only done a fraction of the math that you need to determine whether it actually makes sense. So manufacturing in China often means that you have to spend time in China, and that means trips over there. That means renting a place. That means having a person on the ground watching the assembly line and making sure that there aren't defects that are ending up in the product. It also means that you have to pay people to do translations, and there are all these, there's greasing of palms that takes place. There's import duties and shipping costs. All these things add up and make the difference between China and the United States, not a huge difference. I mean, I should point out that on this slide, there are pink sheets on my bed. And that brings me to my next point, which is talking about communication. So in general, communication in China is not a problem. In Hong Kong, everyone speaks English. In Shenzhen, most people are trying to speak English. And there are smartphones. So when I got in a taxi, I would show a map of where I was trying to go, and they would take me there, and I could follow along using the GPS to know that I wasn't being taken advantage of. Not a problem. Google Translate sometimes failed me, which is why I had pink sheets. But when the technology failed, there are 2 international languages, love and engineering. 3 if you count karaoke. And so what often happened is I would go to these booths and I would have a small notebook and a circuit board with my parts on it. And what I would do is point and draw, and we had calculators, and that's odd. So I would point and draw, and we had calculators and invoices, and all of the parts were on the booth, just for us to communicate non-verbally. In fact, I had an entire conversation with a lady who did wireless stuff. And we had the whole conversation using drawings, and she would pull out the part and plug it into something and show that the light turned on, and we could negotiate how this would integrate with my product and how much it would cost, and all of that. And it was fantastic. So communication ends up not really being that big of an issue. But it brings me to the next point, which is risk. So it turned out that after having this discussion with this woman about wireless technologies, I can't legally sell products that use this technology. She didn't know that the US has regulations that prohibit certain kinds of wireless transmissions. And I didn't know certain Chinese laws, which, by the way, are changing so fast that even the Chinese don't know what the laws are. So there are regulations that make it difficult for someone to manufacture in China. And there's accountability that just doesn't exist. So if something were to happen, I can't go to that person in China and prosecute them or try to make things right, because Chinese law supports the Chinese. So as a small business, that kind of risk is almost unacceptable to me. A single error could put me out of business. And there's delays in shipping too. So if my product takes a month to manufacture, then a month to ship, and I open up these boxes and they're all bad, I now have 2 months of products that I can't use, because in that month that it was coming over to me on the boat, there was another month's worth of production that took place. And so that's why it's important, but also expensive, to have a person on the ground or to have someone shipping you parts air, so that it's more expensive, but you get them sooner. Then there's the risk of fake parts, which is a huge problem. So this is a micro SD card, something you would find in your cell phone or camera. And you can get these pretty much at any of a variety of booths. And this says it's 16 gigabytes, which is great. You can store lots of photos on that. So I plug it into my camera, and it says 16 gigabytes. Awesome. And I take a few pictures. Yes, it works. Awesome. So I pay the lady, and I go on my way. But then I take a few more pictures, and it turns out they're overwriting each other. And this isn't really a 16 gigabyte camera. It's really just a death trap for my photos. And now my China experience is reduced to only a few photos. So, but the point of this story is that often people in China will be looking at the short term and looking for that instant profit. And they'll sell you a product that will work for now, but then later they'll change the components without your permission, or they'll make changes that really aren't to the best of your product's goals. And that kind of problem happens a lot. And so there's this risk that is basically not acceptable. So the next part is smart design. And this is actually the last part. So smart design means in the United States, I have access to people who can tell me exactly what I need to know to make my product amazing. So I have access to Sector 67, a local makerspace, where I can use the tools that are available to experiment with different parts and different materials. And they have experts there who can tell me exactly what I need to know about wireless transmissions and about plastic design and enclosures and everything about manufacturing my product. Another interesting difference was that when I went to factories in the United States, they would tell me, yes, we can manufacture that, or no, we can't manufacture that. In China, they would always say, yes, we can manufacture that. In the United States, not only would they say, yes, we can manufacture that, but they would say, here are some things that you can change to make it easier to manufacture. Here are some parts that make it cheaper to manufacture, that make your design more robust and have higher quality. And so you end up with not cheaper design, but a smarter design, because the expertise really lies in the United States. The other important aspect of having smart design is having people on the assembly line and beta testers who can tell you exactly how your product can be used, or new ways that you hadn't thought of, or problems that exist that you hadn't thought of. So for example, if I have my display is not working as well as it should in bright light, then they can suggest to me, well, not only that this is a problem, but they can suggest ways to solve it. And if you think about all of the things that you buy, like think about something goofy that you picked up in some kitschy store. And think about, yeah, this is made in China. And who is the person on that assembly line? And did they really understand what this product was being used for? A lot of times it's no. And so if there are changes being made to that product without your consent or approval, then those changes could be to a huge detriment in your product ultimately. And that's why having someone in the United States who understands the product and the users and how it all comes together is really important. So I want to close by saying that made in China and made in the United States is not comparing apples to apples. It's not even comparing apples to oranges. It's more like comparing apples to some exotic fruit. Because you know you're going to get a fruit, and you don't really know what's going to happen until you take a bite out of it. And it could be a great experience, and it could be really bitter. But in the end, it's an adventure. Thank you.